Global corruption levels remain alarmingly high, with efforts to reduce them faltering, according to the 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index released today by Transparency International. The report has exposed serious corruption levels across the globe, with more than two-thirds of countries scoring below 50 out of 100. The global average on the index has remained unchanged at 43, highlighting the need for urgent action against corruption and warning of a critical global obstacle to implementing successful climate action. Against a backdrop of record breaking global warming and extreme weather events, erosion of democracy, and a decline in global climate leadership, the world has its back against the ropes in its fight against the climate crisis. Corruption is making that fight much harder, and the international community must address the link between corruption and the climate crisis. The latest data shows that many of the countries most heavily involved in international climate action, including climate vulnerable nations and hosts of the international summits such as the United Nations Climate Change Conference, have low and or declining CPI scores. Corruption is obstructing effective climate action by hindering the adoption of ambitious policies. A recent Transparency International report highlighted the significant influence of oil and gas lobbyists at events like COP and activity that also affects political centers around the world. Francois Valerian, chair of the Transparency International, said corruption is an evolving global threat that does far more than undermine development. It is a key cause of declining democracy, instability, and human rights violations. The international community and every nation must make tackling corruption a top and long term priority. This is crucial to pushing back against authoritarianism and securing a peaceful, free, and sustainable world. The dangerous trends revealed in this year's Corruption Perceptions Index highlight the need to follow through with concrete action now to address global corruption. Maria Martini, CEO of Transparency International, said, "We must urgently root out corruption before it fully derails meaningful climate action. Governments and multilateral organizations must embed anti corruption measures into climate efforts to safeguard finance, rebuild trust, and maximize impact. Today, corrupt forces not only shape but often dictate policies and dismantle checks and balances, silencing journalists, activists, and anyone fighting for equality and sustainability. True climate resilience demands tackling these threats directly and decisively. Vulnerable people around the world desperately need this action." Mads Christensen, executive director of Greenpeace International, said, "This year's analysis showed again how fossil fuel corruption undermines climate efforts, including in the United States. Around the world, communities are demanding climate action from their governments, but the people's voices are time and again countered by the corrupting power of oil and gas companies profiting from environmental devastation, who use their billions to attempt to silence critics and activists, to buy power, and to dismantle the protections that safeguard our families and our planet. Greenpeace organizations and our allies are facing such a threat from pipeline giant Energy Transfer, which is trying to wipe us off the map in the US with a massive specious lawsuit. It's up to all of us who care about the future to stand up to these corporate bullies no matter the cost. Most countries that are highly vulnerable to climate change score below 50 on the CPI. Huge numbers of people are at needless risk because corruption is impairing climate projects meant to protect them. This highlights the critical need for robust transparency and accountability measures to ensure the effective use of these funds. Recent Transparency International research shows how corruption can undermine just the transition to net zero, highlighting specific examples in South Africa, Vietnam, and in Indonesia, where insufficient safeguards have created opportunities for unscrupulous actors. In South Africa, around R1 billion is stolen each month from Eskom, the state owned energy provider, according to its former chief executive. Countries suffering the worst effects of the climate crisis have the lowest scores, including South Sudan, Somalia, and Venezuela. In Somalia, climate change has wreaked havoc on the country's agriculture economy and worsened its 30-year long conflict. The CPI report also revealed the extent to which the key players in climate diplomacy are struggling with corruption. which its authors argue is undermining the effectiveness of multilateralism, such as the COP negotiations. Azerbaijan, host of the COP29, at which at least 1773 fossil fuel lobbyists were granted access, scored just 22. COP30 host Brazil will be responsible for securing the $1.3 trillion target of climate financing by 2035. However, in this year CPI it received an all time low score of 34. South Africa, host of the G20 Leaders Summit, has dropped by 3 points since 2019 to 41. Some host countries with below average CPI scores have also contributed to the opacity of these conferences by limiting transparency and participation of civil society. This is a serial obstacle in developing effective climate policy and needs to be addressed moving towards COP30 in Brazil and G20 Leaders Summit in South Africa. Undue influence to obstruct climate policy can happen in countries with both high and low corruption levels. However, it is in wealthy, developed countries that this interference has the most serious impact because it is undermining their work to agree on ambitious goals, reduce emissions, and build resilience globally. Three members of the umbrella group have significantly declining scores: the USA, Canada, and New Zealand. The CPI has also highlighted the human cost of climate corruption. Land and environmental defenders are frequently at the forefront of the fight against the climate crisis, but their efforts expose them to intimidation, violence, and even murder. This is the most common in countries with serious corruption problems. Almost all 1013 murders of environmental defenders since 2019 took place in countries with CPI scores below 50. The CPI ranks 180 countries and territories by perceived level of public sector corruption on a scale of 0 to 100. Almost 6.8 billion people live in countries with CPI scores under 50. This is equivalent to 85% of the world population of 8 billion. For the seventh year in a row, Denmark obtains the highest score on the index, 90, and is closely followed by Finland, 88, and Singapore, 84. Countries with the lowest scores are mostly in fragile and conflict infected areas like South Sudan, Somalia, Venezuela, Syria, Libya, Eritrea, Yemen, and Equatorial Guinea. Over a quarter of the countries in the sample got the lowest score yet on the index, including Austria, Bangladesh, Brazil, Cuba, France, Germany, Haiti, Hungary, Iran, Mexico, Russia, South Sudan, Switzerland, and the United States and Venezuela. Over the past 5 years, seven countries have significantly improved their scores in the index. These include Cote d'Ivoire, the Dominican Republic, Kosovo, Kuwait, Maldives, Moldova, and Zambia. Over the past 5 years, 13 countries saw their scores significantly decline in the index. The significant decliners are Austria, Belarus, Belgium, El Salvador, France, Kyrgyzstan, Lebanon, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Russia, Sri Lanka, UK, and the Venezuela.